Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel dedicated to autobiographies, diaries, correspondences, memoirs, narratives of the self in general. Today we want to talk about the great ethnologist Malinowsky and his unique diary, which has the title Diary in a Strict Sense of the Term, which in itself is a very interesting denomination. Now, Malinowsky is today still very famous for being what is effectively the originator of the ethnographic method. Malinowsky was born in 1884. And at that time, any ethnology was actually done from the confines of a study room in England or in Germany or in America or in France. And Malinowsky introduced the idea that in order to understand what was going on somewhere else, you had to understand the context of it, and therefore you had to go there and investigate. A scientific method a la Bacon, but this time applied to foreign cultures, different cultures. You remember, of course, that the great wave of nationalism in the 19th century had as an effect, and perhaps as a cause, they're linked at least, the idea that anybody who was not like the West was de facto inferior, and whichever rites and rituals and beliefs other people may have, they were, of course, foolish, stupid, barbarian, childish, whereas, of course, the beliefs, the rites and rituals of the West were the right thing to do. Now, that has, of course, it's had a lot of consequences in history, and not only in history in the 19th century, but certainly in post-colonial history. But nevertheless, that was the reason why Malinowsky thought that in order to understand how a people live, what they believe in, why they do what they do, the only way to understand all this was to be there and to understand the society as a whole. Because, of course, Malinowsky had realized that our own societies are incredibly complex as well, and probably very opaque from outside. And if you observe a day in England, a day in America, a day in France, with dispassionate eyes, it is very probable that you see it as a bewildering set of activities that make no sense. You can always, of course, refer to Nigel Barley, the wonderful English anthropologist, who wrote a couple of books about this. And of course, his magnus opus, An Innocent Anthropologist, which I highly recommend, extremely funny, not at all jargony and boring, but which will introduce you to some of those ideas if you find them interesting. Now, Malinowsky went for about 3 years, all told, to Papua New Guinea. And he stayed there on and off on the same island. He moved a little bit around. He moved to 2 or 3 different islands, I think, and then went on expeditions for a couple of weeks here and there. But he stayed on Trobriand Island for the most part between 1914, 1915, and then 1917, 1918. Those diaries were originally written in Polish, because Malinowsky was from Poland. And they were published about 15 years after his death, 20 years after his death. They were published in 1967 by his widow. Now, what is interesting about those diaries? Well, what makes them remarkable is not the style, or at least in its English translation. I read them in English. Because it's not the most fluent style, probably, that diaries could be written in. He's a great scientist, and he's a great observer, and he's a great analyst of things, and perhaps his style sort of suffers, if one can say it like this, from this very methodical, very scientific mind. So in that sense, it's not really a funny diary, it's not a very chatty diary, it's not an ironic diary, It is not, a self-deprecating diary in that sense, something that would bring a little bit of levity to the whole thing. No, these are kind of serious stuff, as it were. And you can see that it's somebody who probably didn't think it would be published, because at that time, Malinowsky, of course, was completely unknown. And so probably he kept those diaries for himself as much as anything else, and we'll come to that in a second. And so there is no attempt here at embellishing things, rewriting things. And so that is certainly one reason why those diaries are fascinating in themselves, is that they are pretty raw, they are honest. Things come out. And those things come out of Malinowsky, the writer himself, and they are not redacted by the desire to, look better than he was. Again, I remind you, they were published about 20 years after his death by his wife. So he had not rewritten them, but by that time, of course, he had become very famous. So what is his main interest, Malinowsky? Well, that also appears here and there in the diary. His main interest is to create a new science, really, or so a new science in the sense of taking an old science with its old ways of doing things and injecting in it a new objectivity, a new scientific method. So he knew what he was doing. He's very clear about that. He is trying to do something that he thinks will change everything. Of course, everything in terms of ethnology and social sciences. And he knows that his work, therefore, or he thinks that his work is really important. He thinks that it's a foundational work. And so for him, what does that mean? It means that he sets himself a task, which is, in a way, both extremely simple and horrendously difficult, and that is to understand the society he's in. Now he's on the small island in Papua New Guinea at the beginning of the 20th century, so you can imagine, of course, that the conditions of life there are primitive, if we can put it in those ways. There is, of course, no electricity or water or anything, and those Papuan still live probably exactly as they used to live for centuries before that. So boating, hunting, and just the everyday life of the village. And that's what he wants to do. He settles in a village, in a hut, and he simply goes about observing everything to try and understand everything. Now, it's a very hard thing to do for us today, but you have to imagine here coming to a society about which you know absolutely nothing. That is, you do not understand what kind of relationship people have. You do not understand, of course, what they're saying in the beginning. You don't understand why they do X, Y, and Z. You do not understand the way they talk. That is not the words they use, but the way they talk to one another. You do not understand what kind of rituals they have. You do not understand whether what they do is a ritual or it's just something that somebody does. Imagine how difficult it is to make sense of a highly complex network of relationships and cultural traits when you have no idea how to get a handle on them. So that is one of the things that is fascinating in this diary, is that no, it is not a notebook full of observations and analytical reflections on the people. If you want that, you have to read his great book, The Argonauts, published in 1920 something, 22 or 3. And that is a massive book full of everything you want to know in terms of ethnology. The diaries are really about his everyday life and struggles, and that is what it's interesting. If I refer to Nigel Barley, the wonderful innocent anthropologist, that is exactly what Barley did. Barley talked about his work as an anthropologist from the point of view of his everyday struggles, making sense of things. And that is exactly what Malinowsky does. And so for that, what we have is a scientist, a great scientist, one of the most important scientists of the 20th century, telling it as it is every day. So, for example, he tells us about, yes, he is ambitious, as I said. He wants to create something new. He sees himself as the originator of something again, that will revolutionize social sciences. His work will be a seminal work. And that means, of course, that he does put a lot of pressure on himself as well to get those things right. At the same time, he has a real pure scientist heart, in the sense that he wants to understand, not simply to be famous because he does understand, but because he really wants to understand. He wants to make sense of something that is so different from what he was born into, what he knows about the rest of the world. So that means here that in many pages there is an openness of mind, which is absolutely necessary for him, of course, because if you want to understand why somebody, I don't know, doesn't bury their dead, you have to try and make sense of that. Why do they do that? What are the interdicts? What are the reasons why they would or wouldn't? What is the equivalent? How do they respect their dead if they don't bury us? We should not, of course, suppose that only burial is the right way to honor your dead, so etc., etc. So you need that objectivity of mind in order to understand what is going on, and that openness to say, okay, it may be repellent to me what is going on right now, but if I make sense of the whole system, maybe that thing that I find abhorrent will make sense within that system, and then it won't be abhorrent anymore. At the same time, and that is fascinating in this memoir, these diaries rather, is that he finds it difficult. Let's be honest, and that is, again, fascinating about this, is that he does find it difficult to maintain this openness of mind. And at times when things are not going well, because of the weather, because of his health, because of his incomprehension of things, because many times he despairs of ever understanding what is going on, at times he lashes out at the people. And so he lashes out in a way that makes it clear that for him, yes, in him, there's still the idea that they are savages. And he fights that idea because he wants to understand, because he knows that if he thinks that they are savages, he will never understand them. But sometimes it's just too much. And so you have this love-hate relationship with the natives, which is in itself fascinating, and he's aware of it. And again, he is aware that giving in to those very Western-centric 19th century ideas of the supremacy of the way the West was doing things, giving in to that idea is the ruin of his work. So he cannot do that. But you do not get rid of a whole education in a certain system simply by willing it. And this constant struggle between those two things is absolutely fascinating, of course, in this diary. Now, equally fascinating, but for a different reason, are his struggles, his everyday struggles as a human being. Now, Malinowsky at the time was still very young, and he wasn't married, but he obviously had a couple of women that he was attracted to, interested in, that he knew. And you have to realize he was on an island thousands and thousands of miles away from anything known, in a society he hardly understood, surrounded by people very different, for whom it was not necessarily, anything really interesting. And he misses the people he knows, he misses the company that he knows, and he misses women, of course. So he is also open as much as a, of course, 19th century educated person can be, let's be honest. Yes, sexual desire comes into it. How does he deal with that? Not in a gross way, obviously, but in the sense of how does that impact his stay on the island? How does that impact his desire to understand things? The longing for others like him, the longing for discussion. He has wonderful lines about the longing for music, beautiful things. And that's all the fragility of the great scientists that come through. Women, yes, knowledge of what's going on. He has no idea what's going on in the world. He gets absolutely no news about the First World War, which he knew was brewing and coming when he left. He knows nothing about what's been happening. he knows nothing of anything because he's completely isolated and he lives in that society which itself is isolated from the rest of the world. So those personal struggles are also coming through. And it is in those diaries, and as in so many diaries, it is one of the main interests, of course, of the content. It is how does one, who on the surface is so analytical, scientific, who will produce the most important work in anthropology, perhaps of the 20th century, how was it day to day? What did he struggle with? And what kind of opposition is there between the man or the woman within the scientist? And so, in conclusion, we can say that Malinowski's diaries are a different breed because they are a bit brooding, they are at times a bit dark, they're not always exciting. He doesn't really analyze what he sees, that's for his scientific work, but they are fascinating for what they reveal about the man himself. And if you don't know him, it doesn't really matter because it reveals what it is to be a scientist, trying to have a certain approach to things, trying to understand something which is very hard to understand, and at the same time, being a man far from his family, far from his friends, far from his culture, isolated, trying to reach a point, but not exactly knowing whether he can, whether he will, defeated at times, and sometimes reveling in the discovery, in the understanding of something. And those diaries show us all those aspects of research, of thinking, and of being. And for that reason alone, they are absolutely worth your time.